evening to you. It's just gone 6 o'clock. Welcome to the Full View on SABC News. I'm Francis Hurd. Well, we're on the eve of Freedom Day, tomorrow marking 25 years into democracy, marking our first democratic elections. We will be crossing live to my colleague Tsepisa Makwetla. She's at the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg tonight, taking us through some of the milestones of the past 25 years. And please join in that discussion. We're streaming the debate live on sabcnews.com. Also on our YouTube channel, look for SABC Digital News. And of course, we have the SABC News app. You can follow that debate and engage with us on Twitter, hashtag SABC Freedom Debate. First, a reminder of today's top stories. Fired National Prosecuting Authority Deputy Head Advocate Nomgcobo Jiba remains defiant after President Cyril Ramaphosa confirmed her axing that was alongside the Special Director of Public Prosecutions Advocate Lawrence Mwebi. It follows damning findings against the pair by the Mokgoro inquiry. A report found that the pair lacked integrity and leadership, and they've compromised public trust in the MPA. In a media statement, Jiba described the president's decision to fire her as grossly unfair. Mwebi says he will await Parliament's decision on that matter. Now, Mine Worker and Construction Union AMCU says a political agenda behind the notice to suspend its registration as a labour union because of its failure to hold its national congress last year. AMCU President Joseph Matunjwa says the labour union is complying with the Labour Relations Act and will hold its elective conference next month. He gave a timeline of its correspondence with the Labour Registrar. Matunjwa briefed the media on that matter today. One person has been killed after Cyclone Kenneth slammed into northern Mozambique, destroying houses, uprooting homes, knocking out power. With wind gusts of up to 280 kilometers per hour, it was the most powerful storm on record to hit the country's northern coast. Zimbabwe is now bracing for the possible impact of heavy rains and high winds. The eThekwini municipality estimates that the interim cost of damage caused by the recent floods to be about 658 million rand. The assessment has been done by various municipal departments. This week's devastating floods left 67 people dead and displaced about 1,000 more. And in sporting action, Caster Semenya cruised to victory in the 5,000 meters at the South African Athletics Championships last night. This as she waits for the verdict of the Court of Arbitration for Sport in an appeal against regulations seeking to limit her testosterone levels. Semenya won in a time of 16.05.97 on the opening day of the championships. The South African team will compete at the World Championships in Doha in September. Now, tomorrow, South Africans will recount and take stock of the last 25 years as we commemorate and celebrate Freedom Day. This freedom didn't come easy, remember. The country came close to the brink of a civil war. South Africa went through many phases before stability in 1994. Part of that history played out in Makhanda, formerly known as Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape. The City of Saints, as it was also known, is hosting the annual celebration this year.
It's a day for future generations to remember as the ratification of political freedom at the ballot box. On the 27th of April 1994, millions of South Africans were able to vote for a democratic government for the first time in their lives. The celebration this year will also commemorate the lives lost in the Battle of Grahamstown. The Xhosas and the European settlers clashed on the 22nd of April in 1819.
That battle, we are celebrating that battle, 200 years of that battle, led by Makhanda, after whom this city is named. So part of the consideration of government was to celebrate those events and to commemorate those events, and also to bring unity to people. So the theme is really reconciliation, nation building. So Grahamstown became an ideal place.
Grahamstown was named after John Graham. He led an army to clear 20,000 Xhosa tribesmen from the area. Recently, the town has been renamed, this time, to honor the man who led the Xhosa warriors against Graham, Makhanda. He is described as a Xhosa warrior, philosopher, prophet, and a military man. He was also an advisor to the Xhosa leader at the time, Chief Ndlambe. Makhanda surrendered in an attempt to broker peace. He was incarcerated on Robben Island.
It is believed that he had a gift as a small boy, a spiritual gift, which he later on practiced as a diviner. Some would say in isiXhosa itola. So he was an advisor and a diviner under the leadership of Chief Ndlambe.
The name change was not universally welcomed, but the Minister of Arts and Culture, Nathi Mthethwa, said that during the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was recommended that the renaming of geographic features be a form of symbolic repatriation to address an unjust past.
When you look at his history, it's significant because it represents any other warrior, any other soldiers that went into battle and fought against the British. And their names might not be known today, but I think Makhanda stands for those people.
The people of Makhanda are living with substandard service delivery and water supply problems. They feel their rights are violated. They are happy to receive President Cyril Ramaphosa, but feel there is nothing to celebrate.
We cannot celebrate freedom. Freedom is not something that you are told that you are free. Once you are being told, it means there's everything wrong with that freedom. So we cannot celebrate freedom, not democracy. When people are struggling to have water, when the taps have run dry, if the taps have water, the water is contaminated. When the unemployment is skyrocketing, it's between 67 and 70%. It means if you meet 10 people on the streets, 7 of those people are unemployed. When people are swimming in unemployment and poverty, there is no way that we can celebrate freedom.
No. The residents of this town, especially the residents of the east part of town, have had water outages for many years. They feel neglected. Of course, having the president of your country visit town is an opportunity that residents want to take up. But I'm confident that residents will make themselves heard. The challenges we have as a town are significant, and we have a lot of residents in this town who feel left out, and they've been speaking up, and their needs haven't been responded to.
While South Africa celebrates Freedom Day, millions of voters are due to make their mark once again in the general elections next month, the outcome of which will affect the lives and future of the country for the next 5 years. Ifwe Bodi, SABC News, Makhanda.
So before we make history with a new election, we're looking back tonight on milestones across the last 25 years. Let's cross now live to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. That's where my colleague Tsepiso Makwetla is standing by. Tsepiso, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Francis. Thanks a lot, Francis. We're coming to you live, as you say, from the Apartheid Museum. Built in 2001, a unique experience, it said, an architectural feat which sets apart South Africa from the rest of the world. And of course, South Africa did have a very unique experience in terms of the colonialism of a special kind that some of say it has experienced. And you'll find here at the Apartheid Museum something that takes you through the rise and fall of apartheid, including from the very start at the ticket office, where people are randomly assigned races and turned to going to different turnstiles just to highlight the apartheid experience. And of course, you'll also find here artifacts, various artifacts pointing to the kind of lives that people led. You'll read about the history of George Bezos, talking about how the Greeks first came here in the 1800s. And of course, that will also tell you about people like Avi Buertas, who was born to a poor family described as among the colored people, and it'll tell you about the struggles that they had. If you see next to me here a huge placard talking about what happened between 1886 and 1955, there can be no doubt that the historian will point to the period between the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand and the establishment of the city of Johannesburg as a turning point in the history not only of Southern Africa but the whole continent. It really is a multimedia exhibition where you will hear sounds and you, as I mentioned, will see artifacts, photography. I'm looking here at a beautiful tribute to Brahu Masekela, whom you know as having passed away last year, and talking about his birth, pictures of him with his son at the age of 5, Mabusha Masekela. So this is where you learn about life under the apartheid regime, and of course you will also hear a little bit more from our panelists of the South African transition. What were the trademarks? What should be the litmus test of whether or not South Africa is truly democratized? And we'll tell you a little bit more about that later on, Francis. A quick break and we'll turn here to the Apartheid Museum, where we get into conversation with Leon Lowe, Dr. Snuki Zigalala, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, and look at those milestones and talk about whether or not they're comparable with other post-colonial countries on the African continent, and whether or not there's been real change from the political landscape to the daily lives of people.
The SABC News mobile app is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest in breaking news. Watch the SABC News channel along with clips and live streams of all the big news events. And listen to all the SABC News radio stations live, including podcasts and much more. Simply download the SABC News app to your Android or iOS device from either the Play Store or the App Store. SABC News, independent, impartial.
On Trends Travel, we bring you a full guide on all things lifestyle related. With so much to discover, we give you comprehensive reviews of places to visit, music, travel, and food. We also explore the arts, whether on or off stage. All this and more. Be sure to tune into Trends Travel Saturdays at 5:30 p.m.
Sam, we want an MC up my conveyor, she's fine.
Alright, she's going to use her help.
What hand? She's got a lot of mic, your one.
I can't.
All right, Tsepiso Makwetla getting ready there for that live, crossing this is live TV. As soon as she's ready, we'll take you back to the Apartheid Museum. And tonight she's going to be looking back at some of the milestones over the last 25 years. The first democratic elections of 1994, that's being commemorated tomorrow on Freedom Day. 1996, the signing of the new constitution. Nelson Mandela's involvement with the rugby players helping South Africa to win that World Cup. Again and again, these milestones, but like you heard from some of the people in what's formerly known as Grahamstown in Makanda, saying, is it true freedom if people don't have water in their taps? Is it true freedom when we have a soaring unemployment rate? South Africa is still one of the most unequal countries in the world. And Amnesty International earlier this week called on all the politicians taking part in this election to put human rights front and center, saying many are not prioritizing things like the concerns of ordinary people, like climate change, things that will affect African countries very deeply. All right, we'll take you back to the Apartheid Museum as soon as we can. Sabiso Makwetla not hearing us now, but she is with guests there, and we'll bring you that discussion as soon as we can take it.
Be ready when the future calls. To share your ideas, your talents. Celebrate moments that matter. Nurture your family and community. Passion, determination, hard work. That's what drives you. Imagine a bank that's passionate about supporting your growth, that joins you on your financial journey and is part of your future. That's you bank, growing with you.
This is the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial.
When news happens around the world, we will bring it to you. We will keep you informed. Each day, every day, our news team digs deeper, getting all the facts to provide comprehensive reports to what's important to you. We cover all corners of the globe. SABC News, independent and impartial.
Political parties have delivered their manifestos, and now it's time for you to make sense of it all. From campaigning to declarations.
Let's speak to the people on the ground.
We are sick of crime.
Interesting comments coming from the ground there.
SABC News delivers unrivaled, unrestrained coverage, giving you the platform to express your views.
I want more job opportunities.
SABC News will be live from all corners of the country. You will get expert analysis in all languages, party reactions, and the true story behind the numbers.
It's all about the numbers.
Across 4 TV stations, 19 radio stations, and online platforms. SA Decides 2019. SABC News, independent, impartial.
SABC News is producing more than 150 election-related programs ahead of the May 8th election. If you think our content is not in line with our editorial policy, direct your complaints in writing to complaints@sabc.co.za. Complaints on election-related broadcast content should also be lodged with ICASA's Complaints and Compliance Committee by sending an email to bmashihu@icasa.org.za or call 012 568 3233.
Great to have you with us on the Full View. About 29,000 South Africans living abroad will be casting their votes tomorrow, and the Independent Electoral Commission says it's all systems go. The highest number of expatriates who will be voting abroad are in London at 9,000. Dubai has 1,500 or thereabouts, the Netherlands 1,300. Earlier, we spoke to IEC Chief Electoral Officer Simon Mabolo.
29,000 of them have indicated their wish to vote abroad, and all missions have confirmed readiness, all logistics, all ballot papers have been received, and Auckland in New Zealand will be the first station where voting will be happening tomorrow.
Yeah, so let's talk to sort of numbers and areas that we're looking at. So you've got 29,000 people. Who has the most, or where are the most registered people?
The most registered people are in London, so they'll be voting at the mission in London, just in front of the Trafalgar Square. We've made good preparation, and everybody should be able to cast their vote without difficulty there tomorrow.
Okay, so London is the most, I imagine.
Followed by Dubai at 1.5. London has 9,000 odd people, and the second is Dubai with 1,005. Then the Netherlands, 1,003. and then Canberra and Abu Dhabi just over 1,000.
That is fascinating, because I think a lot of people would want to know, like, where in the world are South Africans located that still want to vote, still want to participate in South Africa's elections and the electoral system. And, you know, the reasons that a lot of people are away, I imagine some for work or some have relocated permanently.
Indeed, there's a huge South African expatriate community in the UK in general. Because of our historic ties, one presumes, with the United Kingdom. There are students, there are those that are working, and of course those who may feel uncomfortable with the political, economic direction of the country. But they remain South Africans, and they remain with the right to vote in terms of the Constitution.
Logistically, how does it work? Because obviously we know that when elections are happening, the votes are counted at the particular polling station. They are then sent to the IEC. But when we're talking overseas, how exactly does that work?
After voting at the missions, the ballots will be sealed in double envelopes and returned back to South Africa. And once all ballots are back, we will convene party agents and do a verification of all the ballots that were cast, and they'll then be counted. It's a process that will take approximately 2 to 3 days to count all the ballots from the missions.
Okay, so it's counted here in South Africa. Can South Africans vote at embassies, or it's already they know where they're going to vote? So it's not that they have to vote at an embassy or a consulate or any other diplomatic office?
It has to be, in law, it has to be an embassy, high commission or consulate, because in terms of international law, there is territory of the Republic. So these votes, although happening all over the world, they're happening on South African soil throughout the world at 121 missions.
So the voting process already kicking off tomorrow around the world, but we're going back in time now, 25 years ago. Tomorrow, South Africans went to the polls in the first democratic elections. Tepiso Makwetla, my colleague, is at the Apartheid Museum tonight, looking back at milestones in 25 years of democracy. Tepiso, over to you.
Okay, Tepiso, Paul is asking if you can start with Dr. Zigalala and come this way.
All right, thank you very much, Francis. And as you say, South Africa is celebrating Freedom Day tomorrow, which is the 27th of April. We look back at the last 25 years of democracy, where change, some say, occurred in every aspect of life in the wake of the end of apartheid, whether real or imagined. And we'll flesh out some of those concepts. But following the 1994 elections, you saw what were former enemies putting together a transitional RDP into effect, which was developing a new democratic order or constitution modeled after the US Constitution and Bill of Rights. And while some say this brought about optimism, others question whether or not there should have been concern about realism, demonstrating just how complex and difficult the radical transformation required by South Africa really is. A quarter of a century later, we look at some of the milestones that have colored South Africa's journey. To talk a little bit more about this, from the African National Congress, the governing parties, MK-MVA, Dr. Snuki Zigalala. He's immediate to my right, joined next to him by Ms. Lebohang Pheko, who is a senior research fellow at Trade Collective and a political economist as well. Immediately to her right is Leon Lowe of the Free Market Foundation. Welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining us on this Friday. Perhaps let me just start with an establishing questions for all of you to get a sense of where you think we are 25 years on. What would be your own personal milestones? Dr. Zigala, let me start with you.
Yeah, well, I'm Snuki Zigalala from the ANC Veterans League.
Veterans League, indeed.
Veterans League. I think we've made great strides as a country. As you know, in 1994, it was the first democratic elections where a majority of people gave power to the ANC. And it was for the first time we had a black president in South Africa in 1994, which was led by Nelson Mandela. I think for the past 25 years, as ANC's governing party, it has achieved a lot for poor South Africans. 84% of South Africans have electricity in their houses. 94.3% of our people have access to education. 3.2 million houses have been built compared to 13% in 1994. 88% of our households in South Africa have access to water. And in terms of education, we have 94% of South Africans who are literate, who can read and write, which is a great achievement for us. I think we've made great strides in the country itself. And of course, the economic growth has been there until we had the economic slump in the world that brought down our economy. I think we have made great strides in improving the lives of the poor people, both black and white, and I think we still have a lot to achieve.
Whether or not she agrees with how you've characterized the progress we've made, but whether or not that also falls in line with her milestones of 25 years of democracy. Ms. Peko?
So I think that it's been an interesting ride. I mean, one of the difficulties of trying to assess South Africa is that we came into our post-independence about 30 years after most of our peers, into an entirely different era, entirely different governance and democratic dispensation, and also an entirely different way of viewing the colonial question. And one of the disadvantages of having been latecomers, so to speak, is that the terrain is quite different to the way it was for our peers such as Zambia or Ghana or Kenya and others. 2 or 3 major milestones would be our capacity in the last couple of 10 years or 12 years or so to have almost seamlessly recalled 2 presidents. And I think that in terms of the democratic and the landscape of our country, those have been massive ground-shaking moments in different regards.
Why would ours be different? Because of what they say is colonialism of a special kind?
Yes, which I don't think was that special. So I think that our definition in trying to characterize it entirely as an apartheid question, which was to do with a race-related way of characterizing social relations, is not quite true. It was an entirely different colonial question in common with many other colonial questions across the continent. And what the difficulty and the limitation of the South African question was in trying to then remove fundamentals of occupation, sovereignty, of land away from the equation and almost turning it into a race relations issue, a sort of a civil rights issue, which it really never was, and it still is not, in fact, because if we look at patterns of inequality in this country, there is still a racialized pattern to the ways in which distribution of privilege, of wealth, of education, of economic benefits are still distributed between most people in this country.
And Mr. Lowe, I suppose this is the reason why organizations like yours are in existence, because of your point of view on how some of these issues ought to be tackled. So just to springboard from that conversation, looking at your milestones in terms of 25 years, is there something to celebrate?
Yes, I think I don't see this as binary. It's not all good or bad. It's not triumph or defeat. It's a great deal of both. The thing to celebrate is very substantial, and the doctor did an interview to tell us about that. And I just want to make a statistical statement. This is not an opinion. People are entitled to their own opinions, not their own facts. And the facts are that by every single statistic, life expectancy, access to motorized transport, waterborne sewage, safe water, infant mortality, literacy, access to healthcare, every single statistic shows a fantastic advance for black South Africans, and that should be celebrated. Much of that, we in the Free Market Foundation point out, was achieved by themselves, just using their own freedom, newly gained freedom. The negative side, of course, everyone knows, is many people were not carried forward with that. So if you go to historically destitute areas like Bosbok, Randbushbuck Ridge, or the Makatini Flats or something like that, you used to see incredible poverty there. You go there now, you see middle-class homes and beautiful roads and TV dishes, and it's actually hard to believe that such changes have taken place. And young people don't really appreciate this because they never saw what it was like before. So I don't want to sound like a propagandist for the ANC, that's your job, not mine, but nonetheless the accomplishment is spectacular by every objective statistic. There have been lots of failures, and I want to point that out. One is tomorrow on Freedom Day, we, the Free Market Foundation, will be handing over the last of 200 title deeds to women who have been living in land they didn't own, and as of tomorrow will walk in as landless people and walk out as landowners. And this will be our way of celebrating Freedom Day with donations from Swedish business people who love South Africa, South African business people. So land remains tragic. In fact, the doctor's own parents were expropriated in Alex Township, and to this day their land has not been restored.
So let's get into it then, the foundation for how we came to be where we are, and those social and developmental problems facing South Africa today. Is the link the failure of the transition processes? And I'm talking here about CODESA in the 1990s, and I'm talking here about the TRC. Ms. Peko, perhaps if I could get you to answer that question.
So I think most of the failure is really to do with one of a misunderstanding of what it means to have a longitudinal social transformational agenda. And I think one of the issues is that, and I'd beg to differ slightly with one of my colleagues in that the statistics, several statistics would also beg to differ and say that since 1994, the percentage of the quality of life for African people in this country has actually diminished by about 12%, whilst in fact it has been enhanced by about 15% for most European or white people in this country. Now, I think going back to what you're saying in terms of the forms of redistribution and the forms of growth that have been put in place in this country, a lot of these have to do with a really market orthodox approach, which suggests that let the economy do what it wants to do, enable foreign direct investment to be one of the key pillars of growth in this country, and also with the hope that there'd be a trickle-down effect of social redistribution. That hasn't been borne out. There's still huge numbers of structural unemployment in this country. The official statistics speak at about 26 to 27%, and the unofficial statistics put that closer to 40 or 42, 43% if you count the people who are too depressed or too despondent to keep looking for work, or who don't even have the means to keep on looking for work. So the model that has been pursued is one that really hasn't been able to put the economy back in the hands of the majority of the people. And I think if we're speaking about a kind of a redistribution, which is about substantive ownership of the economy in the hands of the African majority, it's well and good to talk about access to land, and well, not even access to land, access to water and education, but the quality of many of those social amenities is incredibly poor. And of course, the key economic levers are still not in the hands of African people.
So let's hear from you, Dr. Zigalala. Just picking up from that point, the fact that South Africa, the democratic South Africa, had been in a position where it is back into the international fold. And I'm going to look at some of the things that would have guided how you modeled this transition period. The World Bank, for instance, defining governance and the manner in which power is exercised and management of a country's economic and social resources for development. Was that too narrow a definition when you look at it now, just in terms of how you would have modeled what South Africa should be to fulfill your promises, but also to be acceptable to international financial institutions, for instance?
Well, yeah, I think I tend to differ with my colleague here on the right when you're saying that we are not South Africa is not colonial of a special type. We're talking about colonialism or colonialism of a special type because we had the colonizers and the people who are colonized living in one and the same country compared to African countries. And so when we got our independence in 1994, we had to bring all the two warring parties together. The disadvantage that we have as Africans is that the capital itself, the markets were owned by white people. That's why Black Economic Empowerment was introduced. So as to bring Africans into the economy to ensure that Africans own the economy itself. And so it has been a battle of course, to ensure that we skill our people, we ensure that we bring our people on board in terms of owning the means of production. Up to today, there are very few Africans who are owning means of production. And so for us, what is important as the African National Congress is to improve that slide and ensure that the majority of black South Africans get into the economy, they own the economy, they run the economy, and of course they should be employers instead of employees.
So what are you suggesting, Dr. Zigalala, is the competing, exigencies of concepts such as democracy and governance?
Well, democracy and governance, we can talk about that, but as you know, that when you talk about governance, governance comes with responsibility, and if people have to attune to governance. Governance is not just a word that you can talk about. And when you talk about governance, people have to know exactly where governance comes from. And so if our people, especially those who are marginalized, come into the mainstream of the economy, they understand what governance is all about, then we will have a ripple effect in terms of improvement of quality of life of our people.
And I can see, Ms. Peko, that you are not quite in agreement with some of what Dr. Zigalala is saying on your argument that actually there was too much conflation in terms of South Africa and some of the challenges that it faces, or rather tunneling it down to apartheid and where we are at the moment, saying that the colonialism that we faced here in South Africa may not necessarily have been as special. So in comparison with other African countries, their transition periods, has ours been slowed down by the presence of the settler community that were the cause of what Dr. Zigalala says is why there had to be a multi-pronged approach to how South Africa exercises its transition?
So I don't think that there had to be a multi-pronged approach. I think that the series of compromises and concessions that were made at Codesa are really still hampering us today, especially as the African majority. And it's certainly the presence of settler colonialism and the proximity to that would be a different experience to some extent to Nigeria or Ghana or some other countries. But I still don't think that it was entirely a different question. It was still a question of land, of dispossession, and of an African sovereign state that needed to be put into place. And we've sort of overplayed the idea that it was necessary to make these concessions. I think to the extent where we have a generation of young people who today are not even experiencing the benefits per se of freedom, and to the extent to which you would expect, the fees must fall, roads must fall, because the colonial imagination is still very visceral, still very present, and these are young people who don't have a memory of, as Mr. Lowe was saying, who don't necessarily have a recollection of apartheid, but for some reason, of course, it is still living with them, it is still their lived experience, and they still don't have the means to fully access what should be a democratic African sovereign state.
And Mr. Lowe, just to your mind, the manner in which South Africa has approached its transition, the democratization of its populace, and I'm thinking of what Ms. Peko was raising, the issue of FDI, there's also the issue of foreign aid, and obviously a lot of that comes with stipulations on the approach or the policies that a government should approach. Has it been to the full effect of people feeling that 25 years of freedom, which you say, to their credit, they are where they are?
Yes, let's understand something very simple. We've had economic policies which have resulted in slow rates of economic growth, and in the last decade or two, actual stagnation, essentially none. Had we grown at, just to give a round number, at say 10% since 1994, instead of the South African per capita income now being about $7,000, it would be closer to $30,000. In other words, if we paid more attention to simply becoming wealthy, we would now be one of the richest countries on earth had we followed high growth economic policies, with which, by the way, we started, but they were very soon diluted and watered down, so that we now have policies that all over the world, it's very, very simple, you look around the world, which policies coincide with prosperity, and we are going the other way, we are doing the opposite. And the policies that coincide with prosperity are the policies that are more market related. You free the market, you attract inventors, you liberate. So for example, take South Africa's unemployed people, and you've mentioned that it could be as high as 40%. I want to just say how shocking it really is. Young black South African women, we're talking about 65% unemployment. And now this is absolutely tragic. And the only way to have jobs for all South Africans is to be rich. And how do you get rich? You adopt high growth economic policies, and that probably is the big failure. The transformation, the rise of living standards of black South Africans has by all statistics been astonishing, and we should celebrate that. But we should lament the fact that we have failed to adopt economic policies that produce prosperity, that make us rich. We just need to be rich.
So I want to then go to the environment under which some of these policy proposals came out of, and whether or not there was a real exercise, if we look at the TRC, for instance, of what it was supposed to achieve, that is a real acknowledgement of what happened in South Africa, people being held to account. Was it driven more by a political end, as in a political exercise, and is it the reason why we are where we are when we talk about some of those issues? You can answer the question, Mr.
Let me just say that I'm not an expert on political issues.
But just to your mind, when you look at whether or not we have achieved that transition, and what could be some of the reasons?
I don't think so. I think we have a lot of suspicion. I think we have a lot of unanswered questions. I think there's a lot of behavior that was reprehensible and never fixed. And I'm afraid there's been a lot since as well. So maybe the need for a TRC type exercise is not even behind us, but maybe to some extent ahead of us. But I would just say that I really want us to say, if we are wealthy, and I'm sorry to sound so materialistic, many of these things will no longer seem like big problems. I'm not saying they go away, and I'm not saying you forgive people for wrongdoing. On the contrary, I want them to answer for it and to be completely accountable. But I would say that we need to be very much more focused on how to become one of the world's rich countries. And at the moment we're failing dismally at achieving that.
Ms. Perk, how do we become a rich nation? How do we become a united nation? How do we become that rainbow nation which was put out to the rest of the world if we haven't dealt with intrinsically what is wrong with the country and its system? We're one of the only few countries in the world that have systemized discrimination. And the TRC, many say, failed to do that, not only in just the form of reparations, but just really getting a clearer picture of South Africa in entering this democratic era.
So, I mean, the TRC was probably an entry point to what should have been a much deeper conversation and an ongoing process of excavating pain, excavating wrongdoing, excavating accountability, and certainly implementing some sort of restorative justice. And that didn't really happen. I think it was narrowly focused, and I think the timelines were also very, very, very short. And perhaps it was part of the whole, as you call it, the rainbow nation, whatever that may or may not mean to people. I don't think it exists per se. But it was certainly part of brand South Africa, brand new South Africa, and the idea of reconciliation.
Was that a fallacy? Was it a lie, the rainbow nation?
I think it was. I don't think that people are reconciled even now. People live in silos, and I think that it's also it's still so easy for a lot of people to live in to live in their own community and to never understand what it means, like especially to understand what African suffering means, what black people's suffering means. It's very easy. There are many white people in this country who have never been to a township or who see it as a kind of a voyeuristic tourist experience rather than a lived experience. And I think to pick up a bit on what Mr. Lowe was saying, if we're talking about restoration, when we're talking about a deeper conversation that might be in the future or might be in the present, the whole thing with reconciliation and restitution means that a really sincere conversation about the minority of people who have had centuries of privilege. What are the things they're willing to do? What are the things that they're substantively willing to do? And I think that's where the land conversation also comes into play. But also in terms of corporations and multinationals who for many decades propped up the apartheid regime, propped up that form of really disgraceful colonialism. What about them then also being able to give back and make restitution in that way? I mean, it's quite a fact that post the Sharpeville massacre in 1961, it's absolutely a fact that the apartheid regime was about to fall and that they were bailed out by international capital, mainly, from the Swiss, the US, the UK, etc. What of those sorts of corporations then coming and saying, look, we propped up an evil regime for all these years, and this is what we are financially going to do, economically going to do, and socially going to do in perpetuity to then begin to make restitution. And those are the sorts of truthful conversations that we must have, and the land conversation is just a part of that.
Dr. Zigalala, there are those who say South Africa has gone the way of other African nations where they are a one-party state, where you've seen increasing centralization of power, and it's because of those very issues, that because a majority of South Africans have not really experienced real social change, that you have been able to exploit that as a governing party. Your response to that?
No, majority of South Africans, they have experienced social change. As I've said, that we've improved the quality of education. 94% of our people have access to education. We've got 88% of our people have access to water. And South Africa's constitution is one of the most democratic constitutions.
But it's the very same constitution which some say prevents South Africa to deal effectively with the issue of land, as we saw itself play out in the Parliament of South Africa, where people are able to be landowners, title deed holders.
Yeah, but if you look at the ANC Nasrec resolution, which came up with the question of expropriation without compensation, which is a process that is undertaken as the ANC, which we hope that the bill will be passed in the next coming elections, so as to give more land to black people. So that people must till the land, people must be able to own the land, because land was taken from us by the white colonizers. And so that's one of the most important aspects that we addressed at the Nasrec conference, which is a breakthrough. And of course, we are saying that the land that is not used by the farmers must be given to black workers, so that black workers can be able to farm that land. And so we are saying that as the African National Congress, we encourage black people to be involved in.
But are you holding true to that social contract, which was really what I'm asking of you? Because if majority of South African blacks, and you hear a lot of this, the sunset clauses when they vilify the situation that is going on in the country. We saw the Andristatani service delivery protest in 2011, while some saw it as a failure of the criminal justice system, some saw it as a failure of the government of the day to deliver what they promised.
Yeah, we do admit in our manifesto to say that we have failed society in terms of service delivery. It was not because of being reckless, it's because some of the municipalities are not able to pay the rates, are not sustainable. We as ANC, we are saying that we agree that that's one of our major failures. Most of the municipalities are not functioning properly. We agree that they must be fixed. That is why we have the evaluation that is headed by Dr. Nkosazana Zuma to ensure that all the municipalities that are there are functioning optimally, that you get skilled people in all those municipalities, and you get rid of corruption which has been there, and you must make sure that you hold people accountable, especially mayors and councillors, so that they provide quality service to ordinary people. That's what is important.
Ms. Peko, I saw you vigorously shake your head when Dr. Zikala was speaking about the issue of land, but I'd also like to perhaps take the conversation further when you say you admit that there has been failure. No, Dr. Zikala, but I'm just saying, if we're going to talk about governance, we obviously are talking about what you spoke about earlier on, capacity, about efficiency. Yes.
So thank you, Ms. Makwetla. I mean, just to sort of tie tag on to what Dr. Zikalala was talking about regarding land and expropriation without compensation. I think it's fair to say that one of the weaknesses that, or the differences, the ideological differences that the ANC has had with perhaps other formations was exactly around the land issue, because the Freedom Charter spoke about the land belonging to all who lived in it. So this is very new language, and I think that it's important to be truthful and remember that some splinter formations fundamentally disagreed with the ANC in that regard and broke away because of the land issue. And I think it would be useful, if anything, if the land issue is now central to the ANC policy debate, and that if expropriation, whatever that may or may not mean, is now something, the land issue is now something that is different, then to have a much more inclusive approach to this, because certainly there are other movements which have been speaking about that, the EFF being the latest, the AZAPO, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and so on. And I think it's also fair for the ANC to sort of explain why in 25 years, when they had a 2/3 majority in particular, that they didn't change the constitution to enable land restoration, I'd rather say, and land redistribution to the African people to take place.
Mr. Lowe, I'm just wondering where especially your organization would sit on this. Ms. Peko here talks about a new language. So that obviously tells us that we are at a certain stage of transition or democracy, and that would mean that the struggles have changed. That would mean that what would have been a major issue 25 years ago either no longer is or has become even more deeper. So we've had the rise of parties such as the Capitalist Party, and I'm just wondering, is it because of great ideological changes within South African society, and is it because that the democracy has delivered, or because it hasn't delivered?
Well, the interesting thing is that the ideological change in South Africa has been away from land for black South Africans. As all of the stalwarts of the ANC, the founding fathers, explained, what they meant by land ownership was land ownership in the name of the people by themselves. And the ANC has actually violated that. For example, RDP houses, they are all subject to a so-called 8-year preemptive clause. By the time the preemptive clause expires, virtually all of them have actually been illegally traded or let. In other words, the black South Africans to this day live under a kind of apartheid house arrest. They have to stay where the government puts them. And even the land that is so-called redistributed hasn't been redistributed at all. Black South Africans are tenant farmers, and the ghost of Verwoerd has got a big smile on his face saying, if I knew the ANC would implement my racist policy, I'd have given them power long ago. No. Unfortunately, all of the black, or predominantly black parties you mentioned, do not trust black South Africans with land. They do not believe in just letting black South Africans own and freely trade and let and mortgage the land the way white South Africans or black South Africans probably those of us present.
That? Could you
I don't know. I think it's because they just do not trust black South Africans.
But there must be a reason for that distrust. It can't occur in a vacuum.
It's very bizarre. Already black South Africans hold somewhere between 5 and 10 million, nobody knows, pieces of property which they are tenants on. The majority of South Africans to this day are not allowed to simply own their land. And we are doing that. We in the Free Market Foundation have a Kaya Lam project called Meaning My Home, and we are busy converting wherever we can get cooperation. We do, by the way, from all the political parties, even the EFF, and certainly the IFP and the ANC and the DA, where they have municipalities, to actually get black people to own their land. Now, I want every black person watching this program to say, what is it that stops this government doing that? You can have 10 million black South African landowners tomorrow. These preemptive clauses are just an insult to black South Africans, that they live under house arrest. And when they are not where the government put them, then the house gets repossessed. Now, in practice, they don't, because they'd be repossessing all of them. So, in other words, black South Africans are essentially all living illegally at the moment, wherever they are.
All right, Mr.
And that is absolutely despicable. I cannot understand why black South Africans allow themselves to be treated in this demeaning and insulting way.
Okay, I'm going to get Dr. Zigalala and Ms. Peku to respond to that after the break. And of course, we'll also look at the political landscape in South Africa, how much it has changed, and has it changed the fortunes of South Africans 25 years later. We'll be back shortly.
Deserves a glass of not so serious. Come for yours with Richelieu Brandy. Get a 750ml bottle for only $144.99. Only from Tops at Spar. Not for persons under the age of 18.
The SABC News mobile app is your one-stop digital portal to all the news you need. Stay connected with the latest in breaking news. Watch the SABC News channel along with clips and live streams of all the big news events. And listen to all the SABC News radio stations live, including podcasts and much more. Simply download the SABC News app to your Android or iOS device from either the Play Store or the App Store. SABC News, independent, impartial. Political parties have delivered their manifestos, and now it's time for you to make sense of it all. From campaigning to declarations.
Let's speak to the people on the ground.
We are sick of crime.
Interesting comments coming from the ground there.
SABC News delivers unrivaled, unrestrained coverage, giving you the platform to express your views.
I want more job opportunities.
SABC News will be live from all corners of the country. You will get expert analysis in all languages, party reactions, and the true story behind the numbers.
It's all about the numbers.
Across 4 TV stations, 19 radio stations, and online platforms. SA Decides 2019. SABC News. Independent, impartial.
SABC News is producing more than 150 election-related programs ahead of the May 8th election. If you think our content is not in line with our editorial policy, direct your complaints in writing to complaints@sabc.co.za. Complaints on election-related broadcast content should also be lodged with ICASA's Complaints and Compliance Committee by sending an email to bmashihu@icasa.org.za or call 012-568-3233.
Hello, I'm Nana, and I want to tell you a bit about Economics Unbound. It is a live studio current affairs program that brings an understanding of the economy, how it operates, and how it is managed. The show seeks to include ordinary South Africans in purposeful and well-informed discussions about the economy.
The whole corruption and having to pay people to get businesses, it's like killing our businesses.
While providing them with enough information to make better economic and financial decisions.
And we need to start thinking of new ways of creating new structures that are relevant at the time.
Through this program, audiences can look forward to 30 minutes of deep and tough questioning on the issues of the week.
Why do you think that our economy lends itself to such collusive behavior and such concentration of monopolies in key sectors?
On Trains Travel, we bring you a full guide on all things lifestyle related. With so much to discover, we give you comprehensive reviews of places to visit, music, travel, and food. We also explore the arts, whether on or off stage. All this and more. Be sure to tune into Trains Travel Saturdays at 5:30 p.m.
We're explorers. We always have been. Endlessly curious. Always looking for answers. For new frontiers. For new stories. Because that is who we are. From script to screen. From yelling action to taking you on a journey. Radio producers. script writers, on-air presenters, news reporters, sports analysts. We spend late nights creating captivating storylines and earlier mornings keeping you informed, educated, and entertained. For us, it's not a job, it's a calling. We do this and more because you do your part. SABC TV licenses, made possible by you.
This is the SABC News Channel, independent and impartial.
When news happens around the world, we will bring it to you. We will keep you informed. Each day, every day, our news team digs deeper, getting all the facts to provide comprehensive reports to what's important to you. We cover all corners of the globe. SABC News, independent and impartial.
Hashtag SABC News, and just remember hashtag Freedom Debate. We are coming to you live from the Apartheid Museum here in Johannesburg, where we're looking at the milestones through 25 years of democracy. We're in conversation here with Dr. Snuki Zigalala of the ANC's Veterans League, Ms. Lebohang Peku, who is a political economist, and Leon Lowe of the Free Market Foundation. So just before we went on the break, Dr. Zigalala, Mr. Lowe here was saying how there's a lack of faith in black landowners. But if I understood you correctly, I thought you were also speaking to a lack of public trust in the system. Dr. Zigalala, how would you respond to that?
No, I disagree with that. I disagree with that the African National Congress does not have trust in black people to own land. That is why we are saying that the land must be, especially with the Freedom Charter, said the land must be owned by those who live in it. And so there will be no way where the African National Congress can say to black people, if they bought land, they should evacuate it. It cannot do that. If, for instance, there are people who are occupying land illegally, the ANC government does not remove them illegally. It makes sure that it gets accommodation for them somewhere else before them being forcibly removed. And so I totally disagree with what he's saying. The African National Congress cannot dispossess black South Africans of their land. Absolutely. It cannot happen.
And Ms. Peku, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to that first before I ask the next question about the current political landscape. But your response to what Mr. Lowe was saying?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's true. I mean, I'd love to sort of hear his statistics and his sources, but I do think that there's a much deeper question, which is the extent to which African people in this country have not only been dispossessed of our land and of our, of our sovereignty, and that it's an ongoing dispossession. And I think that, in relation to the new language and the changing language that I was speaking about, the changing landscape, it seems as though even post-1994, we've also been unable to re-articulate ourselves in the context of being what it means to be African people in South Africa today, and what it means to be African people on the continent as a community of other Africans. And I've heard some strange things that have been said, about whether, like in the context of the Brexit, should South Africa also have a Sexit? Should we, move from the African Union or leave SADC? And I think there's that weird exceptionalism, which I think is in really poor taste and actually extremely out of keeping with the idea of an Africanist and Pan-African identity, which is really what we need to be thinking about. And we need to sort of stop thinking of ourselves, some people, not all, as some kind of an outpost, like some kind of an Australia or a Canada, some outpost that doesn't belong to the rest of the continent. And the idea that Africa is a place that's out there, that we're separate from, is really something that needs to change.
Does it speak to how much later South Africa came into
the community of African people? Certainly, and possibly also to the extent to which the apartheid machinery happened to do a really decimate the sense of African people's belonging to the rest of the continent. So we weren't here, we were in exile, but I'm certainly told by people in the know that the language and the ideology was things are bad here for you black people, but they're much worse out there, up north. And that, that kind of genocide, I think, on our psyche is something that is also to do with our capacity to think about how we relate to our land and how we relate to this land as belonging to us and not something that's that is not ours, part of our heritage, part of our being, in a way that I think many African people have a much stronger immediate connection to. We were displaced, we were put in Bantustans, we were put in townships, and that connection to this land was removed, and that's something that is a really deep psychic issue that we also need to address, as well as the, I don't want to call it expropriation, but the repossession of this land.
So that then takes me to my next question, Ms. Perkle, and I'll get to you now, Mr. Lobo, because because I wanted to find out, is this indicative of whether or not there is, or perhaps I should ask, is there a change in political landscape in South Africa, and some of these new conversations or more nuanced conversations, are they as a result of a need for a realignment of our politics?
Certainly. So the idea that land is important is an ongoing, is a new and recently reignited political conversation, social conversation. I think it's also an intergenerational conversation. I hear young people talking about when our land comes back. I mean, my nieces and nephews talk about when we get this land back in ways that I think people of a previous generation, even my generation, wouldn't have spoken about it. It would have been an ideological thing. It would have been a philosophical thing. But the inevitability of it was not quite the same. And there does seem to be a shifting groundswell. I don't know if it's the Fallist generation as well, but there seems to be a shifting swell and a lack of patience, especially from younger people. And the notion that a few parties, Robben Island, and all of those credentials, they seem to be receding. And that's also part of framing a new narrative.
Mr. Lloyd, also, I mean, some of the disruptors that were speaking about the new entrance into politics, if we're talking about more than 70 political parties who are contesting all 10 elections, then speaks to the need for greater conversation around certain areas. And some say that's because we also need a greater economic liberalization, empowering more of the ordinary man on the streets. Your thoughts of that? And is there evidence of that in the people who are coming to the fore? And are they disrupting the existing political structures?
I think they're nudging it. I don't think it's disrupting. I think after the election we're likely to see things similar to what they were before. But I think it's a welcome thing, and people are feeling the freedom to go into different political directions. And just to give you a very practical example of how the colonial legacy lives on in the new South Africa, with apartheid of the mind, I'm afraid, is with us. I'll give you a simple example. We're involved in the Free Market Foundation with one of the biggest and poorest shanty towns or settlements in South Africa, Marathon and Delport in Kuruleni, or most people might know it as Germiston. And here you have the existing law for registering townships, for proclaiming land, getting title deeds, becoming owners, makes it, for practical purposes, impossible and illegal and forbidden for people in shanty towns to improve their own living standards. They may not do so under law. And this is the law inherited, designed, the township registration law designed by the apartheid regime for leafy, rich white suburbs, is now applied to poor black people all through South Africa. The Mbeki Trust, we are working with them at the moment, who are trying to lend money to rural women running small businesses. It is effectively banned. It is illegal to lend money lawfully to micro credit organizations like women's groups. And we're talking here about the former First Lady, Zanele Mbeki, will tell you that what they want to do to help and finance rural women is banned by finance laws which were inherited from the past and perpetuated in the new South Africa, that make it essentially impossible to become a financial service provider or a financial advisor for low-income people. In fact, the Financial Services Board boasted to Parliament in 2014 that it had deregistered 14,000 financial service providers. Now, what color do you think they were? Were there any banks or insurance companies or brokerage firms deregistered? No. It was emerging black South African financial service providers and brokers who were banned Now, it's their consumers who are not getting services. And the law that we have now, I'm sorry to say, it's the old apartheid law which lives with us and hangs around the neck of low-income people, stops them advancing. And this is actually the travesty. Colonialism lives in the minds of people who are not getting rid of the laws that were designed to privilege white South Africans and keep black people down, such as our township laws, our building codes.
Is it the fault of the failure of even the GNU of repealing some of those archaic laws? And, or is it the lack of failure in consulting within that transitional period the people who were affected, the biggest constituency, if you're talking about black rural women, for instance?
I was in the anti-apartheid movement, and there are pictures of me here in this very museum, and I was at the Dakar conference, for example. So let me immediately get that out of the way. I used to think it was simply race. Nasty white people, black victims. I now have concluded that there was a dimension that I never appreciated in my years as an anti-apartheid activist, which is the socio-economic dimension. Once people are advanced, living in the leafy suburbs, have bank accounts, are in the middle class, they are completely alienated from the poor. They do not think about them, they do not understand them. We have liquor laws in South Africa, for example, which was passed, which would have made it, and smoking laws which make it technically illegal to smoke in a township like Alex, because you have to be, according to the proposed law, 10 meters from an entrance. You cannot get 10 meters from an entrance in a low-income area. These are laws written by rich people, now rich black people. It used to be rich white people, for rich areas and rich people. The trouble we face in South Africa is, how do you get the current elite, progressed, wealthy black South Africans, like we try to get with the old white South Africans, to relate to the poor and to relieve the poor of these laws that keep them suppressed as they were under apartheid?
Okay. So, Ms. Peko, what is your response to that question or even suggestion? And is it as a result of a lack of implementation of the policies that the democratic government had said it's putting in place? If you look at criticism of affirmative action, of black economic empowerment, the elitism of it, and why you've seen the growth or entry into the political sphere of parties such as the EFF, Black First, Land First, for instance.
So, I mean, a lot of what Mr. Lowe says is actually characteristic of many times when new dispensations come into place, African-led, where there's often going to be an element of elitism, because there's people, the affinity to the finer things and the affinity to acquisition of wealth and so forth is actually, unfortunately, quite intoxicating. And this is really not unique only to South Africa. In often cases, what many colonial states have done is to create an elite, small African middle class or educated class with whom they were very proximate. I mean, the French used to, the Portuguese called them the assimilados, those who had assimilated, and the French had something very similar, assimilant or something like that, where you had a very small class of people who were almost engineered to be the implementers and the continuation of very rabid, narrow elitist interests. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that they don't need the colonizers to be still around for those to continue to be in place. And I think what's very unfortunate is that the governing party didn't take the opportunity post-1994 or even pre-1994 in the negotiation process to ensure and to kind of do an audit of these really reprehensible policy frameworks, which would actually then have been, in a very real way and in a very quick way, had made such a big substantive difference to the social transformation agenda of this country. And that doesn't even need, the RDPs, which are also quickly abandoned in favor of the gears, but it also means then that the psyche of what we see is the notion that black poverty is normative and that white privilege is still being sustained, and that's extremely unacceptable.
Dr. Zigalala, that zero-sum nature of politics, which some have said, and I mentioned the issue of the trend of post-colonial African countries and centralization of power and having one-party states. Some say the problem is that elites hang on to power because that's the only way of having access to economic rewards of the liberation struggle, so to speak. But some say it's because you also end up making academic the problems of people. And I will point to you one very controversial example of this, and that was the big HIV/AIDS debate. Your response to that?
I don't think that the ANC is an elitist party. Absolutely, it's not. Majority of the people who have been elected into senior positions of the ANC come from the rural areas. Majority, I would say, because they're nominated by branches, nominated by branches, then elected, go to parliament. And it's not an elitist organization. It still represents the aspirations of the poor people.
But does proximity to power not bring those that are close to power greater wealth than those who are furthest away from it?
It does, because you change their lifestyles. Because immediately when a person is a member of parliament, he earns more than 2 million per annum. And so it means improves his quality of life. It is a fact. But what we are saying as the ANC is that members of parliament are obliged by the ANC constitution to go and service their constituencies. So that
Is it just members of parliament? Because if we talk about tenderpreneurs, which has become a major issue at the moment, and the high levels of corruption against the backdrop of high unemployment, isn't this a conversation that
if you look at our own manifesto, we do admit that corruption has been our greatest enemy. And so the current government that we're having, especially after the elections in Nasrec, that's why we're talking about renewal and cleansing the ANC itself, getting rid of corrupt people. That is why you have we have the Zondo Commission, which has mentioned a number of people who have been implicated. We have the PIC Commission. We have the Khoro Commission, and the president of the ANC is determined to clean the ANC. And we as veterans, we are fully behind the question of cleansing the ANC and making sure that credible people are being elected into power.
So let me take you back to the conversation that I was raising, that of being an effective government and not being elitist and not making academic the issues that affect the grassroots level. The big HIV/AIDS debate, which we saw a landmark court decision being made forcing the government to give people antiretroviral drugs. And some are critical of it, saying that those are the characteristics of a party that has moved away from the social contract, that is not reacting to what the people are asking for, that are rather continuing to centralize power and pursue their own objectives.
No, the HIV debates, I think, over the last 10 years, the ANC has moved on the HIV debates, and so are providing ARVs to majority of the people in the country, and are spending a lot of money on that, and which is appreciated. And so we have moved on as ANC as an organization. We accept that mistakes were made, and we're moving on. We've moved on, and so it's not true that those who are in power have neglected the poor people. It's not true. The ANC, as I'm saying now, it does represent the poorest of the poor. That is why the ANC is in alliance with COSATU. That's why the ANC is in alliance with the Communist Party of South Africa, because that's where the majority of the poor people coming from. We do sit down with COSATU and say, these are the labor laws that we are putting in place, and COSATU debates vigorously with us in terms of those labor laws. And so we also with the Communist Party, which Communist Party is serving the interests of the poor. And so we are not an elitist party. We'll never be an elitist organization at all.
Okay. Ms. Peko, your response to that, also taking into account the comparisons that you made in terms of the trends and characteristics of post-colonial African governments, and I'm thinking of countries such as Zimbabwe, of Zambia to an extent, of Kenya, of Cameroon. When we're having this conversation with Dr. Zikalala, he says it's not an ANC government issue, and is it really what we cannot escape as the youngest democracy on the African continent?
Maybe to some extent, but I think that we had enough history behind us to at least try to be a bit more reflective. I think that the governing party could have been a bit more reflective, and perhaps more humility in understanding the foibles of power, understanding the foibles of moving from being a so-called liberation movement to a party in government, and being a movement in government, and that those are the characteristics and the DNA are incredibly different. And I think the ANC, like most parties across the continent, unfortunately, always drew from the elite of the community. It was mainly clergy, it was mainly people who were educated by, your mission schools, people from Maria Zell, Marion Hill in this country, even people like Nyerere and others who were very much mission people, often exported to overseas, and the first people to have degrees and so on. So that layer of elitism and being the people who led is very much, there's a proximity between that and the people who have been chosen to lead, not only in this country but abroad. I would have hoped that we would be a bit more conscious about that. And I think that's probably why you have a lot more movements which are emerging now, post 1994 and even before. I think one of the difference between South Africa and many other African states has been the volume and the velocity of opposition movements, and we've come to that a lot earlier. So unlike a Zambia where it was either UNIP or UNIP, a Kenya where it was either KANU or KANU, a Zimbabwe where it's been to a great extent a ZANU or a ZANU, and now an MDC and a few smaller, and the splinters of the MDC. In this country that, you had the IFPs and you had and then immediately your UDMs, and early on in the game there were these splinters. And of course it wasn't only the ANC, even at the beginning it was the ANC, the PAC, ZAPO, and a whole host of other movements. I think also though it's also fair to say that the South African Communist Party in this country is arguably not necessarily very aligned to a socialist or a communist agenda anymore. And I think one would argue that their own proximity with the ANC has been one of convenience, particularly given the number of seats and the number of positions that they get as being part of this tripartite alliance. Others have also argued that one of the difficulties of having a working people's movement, such as a trade union, which has also been in this alliance, is that people have argued that, well, what is this about? Is it about being a political formation or fundamentally being a non-partisan representative of different worker interests? And that has been lost along the way. And now, of course, you have splinters of COSATU, of course, and so on and so forth. And I don't think there's anything wrong with any of this. I don't think that there's anything wrong with splinters, because it shows vibrancy. It shows that indeed that different voices are being given oxygen in order to articulate, different sorts of positions and of ideological views, and that it's not only binary politics, it's multi-party politics. But I do think that it's important for us to understand that in order to move away from this notion that we are self-reflecting, I think that the ANC needs to move away and have a bit more humility, Dr. Zikalala, in this notion that self-cleansing, self-reflection, and that a few commissions are going to show that indeed we've moved away from a really awful period of horrible state capture and corruption and so on. We need to see after the election in a couple of months, years, the extent to which this cleansing has really been effective.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Lowe, there was obviously a time when, in the past couple of years, even through its various elective conferences, that the ANC was speaking about a need for radical economic transformation, and that is something that has been lamented by a lot of people who are looking at South Africa from a development aspect. And Ms. Poker spoke earlier on about FDI, and we often hear about these invisible faces of the markets, of investors, how they would be adversely affected by that, should I say, left turn, if some would call it that radical transformation of the economic infrastructure. Where does the Free Market Foundation stand now, given the fact that it is clear, while that there has been progress, there needs to be a radical shift?
Well, let's say we are in favor of radical economic transformation. Unfortunately, the people who use the term are not recommending anything radical at all. One of the things the ANC should do, for example, is have a poor person's impact assessment on every new law and policy and everyone that's already there, and say, how would this affect poor people? and then they would find all their credit laws, all their town planning laws, all their building codes, all their labor laws impact poor people negatively. So what you want is a very simple radical economic transformation. You want to look around the world and you look at the countries that are prospering and the countries that are stagnating, and it's very simple. Every country that is towards the socialist communist end of the international index of economic systems is poor. Every country that is towards the free market end of the internationally objectively published index has high growth and is rich. Poor countries that move towards that, like China and India and Indonesia and Rwanda and Mauritius and Botswana and Zimbabwe, for example, immediately start moving up towards being rich. All you've got to move is towards a market economy. If we had in South Africa a poor person's impact assessment, and every new law, from the new liquor laws, the new tobacco laws, the new labor laws, the new land laws, the new financial control laws, the new building codes, the new everything, was said, how would this impact poor people? The law would never get through Parliament. So if you want radical economic transformation, you simply say, let's start having laws that don't oppress poor people. And virtually every law in Parliament does that.
If what you're saying is true, why would there be such a growing and marked change in multilateralism? Why would there be such emphasis on governments who are seen not to share the policies or ideologies of the so-called Bretton Woods states?
Well, let me just say, Africa is now the highest economic growth region in the world, sub-Saharan Africa, or what used to be called Black Africa. And the reason for that is very, very simple. Most African countries are now moving towards liberal economic policies. They're privatizing and liberalizing. The ones that aren't remain poor, the ones that are growing. But you can look all over the world, Latin America, whatever.
But aren't there those who depend heavily on foreign aid as well?
No, there's very little. None of the countries that prosper depend on foreign aid. A country like Rwanda, which adopts radical economic transformation, meaning radical market economy policies, it immediately becomes so rich that it no longer qualifies for foreign aid. The same is true of Botswana, the same is true of Mauritius. So it's not rocket science, it's not difficult. You don't need an NDP, you don't need a new commission or committee. All you need to do is open the book of the index of economic systems in the world, compare the economic system with countries that are rich and countries that are poor, and then just do what the ones that are rich do. It's simple. You don't need any more commissions and inquiries and reports and NDPs and gears or anything else. Just do what works. And what works is simple. It's easy to find. Okay. Anyone who goes for 10 minutes on the internet can find out what policies coincide with prosperity. Let's just implement them.
So, Ms. Peko, I'm wondering, and you can share, if you could, Mr. Lowe, allow Ms. Peko to respond to this question. A lot of those countries which Mr. Lowe quotes, many of them have faced pressure for currency devaluation, for removal of subsidies for public services. They have been, if you look at Rwanda, Rwanda was for many years criticized as an autocratic country that is undemocratic, and it certainly did not start off being favored of the West.
I mean, I think what happened in Rwanda was basically a horrible shock, you know, a very violent shock in 1994 with the genocide, where basically the whole country was razed to the ground. That rarely happens, you know, and that's really, that was, I mean, that's kind of catastrophic economic shock that we hope that no country needs to, ever has to endure. And I'd like to also think about when we speak about prospering, there have to be kind of the qualitative indicators as well as the quantitative. And I'm not sure whether Mr. Lowe is referring mainly to the quantitative, which is, you know, your growth figures, your consumer price index, your GDP, which has been criticized as not really the best way of measuring growth, because it's really a post-World War II measure which was used for European countries for them to see how they were recovering after the Second World War, for example. So those kind of measures per se are not necessarily universal, and they're not necessarily the best ones to really measure qualitative quality of life for most places. And I think FDI over the past 20 years has been shown by in many countries, especially many African countries, really not to be the best route to economic growth. It's showed that really what it does is to deplete local industry. It also has de-skilled local economies. It often means that local entrepreneurs and local businesses are not able to compete. So your free market not able to compete with the influx of imports and so on and so forth. It also means that many countries don't use the kind of monetary and fiscal sovereignty instruments that they have at their disposal, taxes and tariffs, to enable them to protect their new industries. So I think that really the notion of prosperity and wealth, it's not a universal construct. We're not Europe, we're not Denmark, we're not America, and so on.
And just to get a final comment from you, Dr. Zikalala, as we run out of time, 25 years from here, and that is assuming that the ANC wins the next elections and the ones thereafter, would prosperity, would a better life for all be centered around state intervention?
No, of course it will. It will, because as we mentioned earlier on when we started, I gave figures of how South Africa progressed since 1994 when we got democracy. Of course, there was a slowdown of economy in 1994. Since 2008 and 2009, there was mismanagement of the economy. We admit as the ANC that the economy was mismanaged, and there was state capture. There were commissions. Those commissions, Mr. Lowe, came out because of state capture, because we wanted to get into the root of corruption. What happened there? That's why those commissions were important. We wanted to find out exactly all state institutions were compromised. If you have the state intelligence was compromised, and so that's what we had. That's why we had to have the state capture. We had to have the commissions, and so if definitely will get 62% votes when on the 8th, will definitely radicalize our economy. Will definitely implement ANC policies. Cyril Ramaphosa made it very clear that the ANC has the best policies in the world. What has been lacking is a question of implementation of those policies. It's a question of appointing skilled, credible, and committed people to drive those policies. And so now he's committed to that.
And that's a good note to end it on. Thank you very much to all my guests, Dr. Snuki Zikalala of the Veterans League of the governing ANC, Ms. Lebohang Pheko, who's a political economist and senior research fellow at Trade Collective. Thank you very much to Leon Lowe of the Free Market Foundation. And just a reminder that there will be another elections debate taking place here at the Apartheid Museum at 3 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. Well, that's it from me and the team here. It's back to you, Francis.